Okay, so this is the panel on Section 10, band membership in Canada, First Nation citizenship, membership, and belonging. I'm Dr. Damien Lee, and with me I have Dr. Pam Palmater, Geraldine King, and Dr. Veldon Coburn. Just a really brief intro to what we're going to be talking about here today. Basically, in Canada in 1985, the Indian Act, or the main legislation governing First Nations and Indians in Canada, was changed in such a way that allowed bands to basically control their own membership or citizenship. And since that time, about a third, maybe just over a third of the First Nations in Canada did so, and actually took this opportunity to control their own membership. And while this has been celebrated by many as an example of self-governance in Canada, in reality, no one's really actually looked at the kind of lived experiences of how this change in legislation has impacted the lives of Indigenous peoples on the ground. And in some cases, things are not great. And so this panel is basically meant to just start a conversation about that and present on some research that the four of us have done in our own research careers. And so the progression for today is we're going to move around with starting with Dr. Palmater. Then I will go and speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have Geraldine King speak, and then Dr. Coburn will speak, and then we'll move into a kind of conversation style piece after that. So with that, I'll just turn it over to you, Pam, and yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Damien. I'm really excited to be part of this panel with everybody, and on this topic especially. I feel like I've just been working on this my whole life. Kwe ni Deluizi Pam Palmater. I'm from the Sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation, an unceded Mi'kmaqi, and my home First Nation is Ugbaganjig, or Eel River Bar First Nation. And because we're talking about all the intricacies of the Indian Act, I am a registered Indian under Section 1, but used to be registered under Section 2, and prior to that was a non-status Indian, not registered at all. I am a band member, which in Canada refers to membership in your local First Nation, which is different from the larger Mi'kmaq Nation. So for any of you who don't know all the political and legal dynamics, that's all the very complex nature of it. Talk about a lived reality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research I did for my doctorate, which was really doing a dive into Indian registration and band membership, and then what I've done since then, which is focused primarily on band membership and working with different First Nations across the country on band membership, some of the issues that they're experiencing, and the legal work that I do still on Indian registration, because we haven't resolved all of the problems with that. And those two are so intricately connected, it's important to talk about it. So my research that I did it started out with looking at traditional laws and traditional customs to the extent that we can know all that pre-contact from oral history, from the information that's passed down. And we know that in general terms, although all nations are very different and have very different histories and cultures and laws, that citizenship or membership or belonging or association, whatever word you want to use, is a relational concept. So today we're so far away from what it used to be, but it was always about relations. Who do you belong to? Who's your parents? Who's your district? Who's your clan? Who's your house? Who's your nation? Basically, who are you related to? And we're talking about living people. And then there's the other dimension for the nation, like who do you claim as part of your nation? And those two things go hand in hand. Trying to look at them separately not only oversimplifies it and kind of puts it in a silo, you're really losing the connection, the kinship, the relational part of it. And that's part of the problem. We talk about these things as rights. The right to choose, the right to identify, the right to assert, without all of the corresponding responsibilities, obligations, laws that go with it. These things are very much tied together. And so for me, it's very much starts, before we even get to band membership, it very much starts with the inherent or sovereign power, authority, or jurisdiction of our traditional nations. That's the foundation of who's deciding who's in and who's out, which we know pre-contact, these things were a birthright. These things happen naturally. They evolve naturally, organically through different kinds of relationships, and not just birth relationships, but there was political dynamics to it, economic dynamics to it. So relationships that were formed, intermarriages that happened between neighboring nations because of trading, diplomacy, economies, and all different kinds of political and military dynamics. And this was all pre-contact. And like I said, it's very organic. And it's really hard to take Canada's legal system, very colonial, racist legal system, and try to put that over top of an organic system that was 100% outside of those kinds of considerations. One of the things that I think is important for anyone who listens to this panel to understand is that our conceptions of relationship to our nation, clan, house, village was never tied to a scarcity or surplus of resources to the extent that it is today. For some people, it's almost exclusively how they identify. I want to be an Indian. I assert myself as an Indian because I want that job, or because I think that somehow Indians get all this money for free, that they're all millionaires, all of these racist myths and stereotypes. And so today we're very much out of balance with that. The colonizers have worked really hard to tie identity to individuals, to blood, to money or benefits or disentitlements, all considerations that are outside of our traditional concepts. Obviously, that was for colonial purposes. They weren't trying to preserve us as peoples, that's for sure. We know that scalping bounties, forced sterilization, 60 scoop, foster care, all of this, the role of Indian Affairs, Indian agents, the Indian Registrar, and of course, based on the Indian Act, have all been designed to assure our assimilation over time. Legislative extinction is one of the ways in which we referred to it, but this disappearing Indian formula that you can somehow measure individual identity by this petri dish of mixing blood. And we all know that this is scientifically false. I mean, this is proven false many, many years ago. You don't get 50% of your blood from your mom, 50% of the blood from your dad. It just simply doesn't work that way. Yet Canada has carried on the legal fiction that determines who's an Indian and who isn't, and that determination of who's an Indian and who isn't somehow is relevant to who's a member of a First Nation and who isn't. And then after many, many generations, we're talking over 140 years of this being forced into our heads, that sometimes gets internalized in ways that people are conscious of, and sometimes in ways that people aren't conscious of. Sometimes people have come to understand this as their tradition. And when you ask them, well, what makes that your tradition? Well, my mom told me. But then you have to go deeper. Well, why did your mom think that? Well, my grandmother told me that. Why did your grandmother think that? Well, that's what the priest said in residential schools, that if we weren't pure blood and all of this other nonsense. So that's the complicating part of it, because genocide, colonization, all of the things that have happened to us is not our fault. We had no control over it. That's how our communities have been oppressed for a long time. And now we're trying to come out the other side and say, okay, what are we doing about our nations who are now split into all these different First Nations? We've got people who are in and out, people who should be in, people who are trying to get in who shouldn't be in because they're, something other than First Nations peoples. And that makes it very difficult. So along comes band membership. So like Damien said, prior to 1985, it was fairly colonially simple. When the federal government's the one who says who's an Indian and who's not, that automatically decides who's a band member. Come 1985, the federal government's like, oh, by the way, guys, because of litigation, we have to reinstate some of the Native women we kicked out and their kids. So if you want to hurry up and make band membership codes, you'll be able to leave some of these people out. I mean, that was the impetus. That wasn't because we recognize your right to be self-governing. It was, here, we will help you be the ones to exclude your own people because we don't want to pay for them. And that that's the political background to the laws that have changed, and that's continued. So you have basically these 4 different kinds of membership codes now for a small number of bands that still use them. So you've got 1 parent codes, 2 parent codes, codes that are almost exactly like the Indian Act, and blood quantum codes. The interesting thing is that since all of this information came out, there's a large number of bands who don't use their codes at all. They just go back to using the Indian Act. Some of them have changed their codes, but they don't have to submit them to Indian Affairs, and they don't have to share them with anyone else. So the current status is not 100% known. We're in the process of that. And I work with a lot of First Nations and some of the tribal governments in the US on things like enrollment in the US or membership here. But it's hard to know an exact, precise picture. By far, what I can say is that the most popular type of code in Canada and enrollment measures in the US for the people that I work with are all 1 parent. So the concept that as long as you have 1 parent who's a member or 1 parent who's enrolled, then you're entitled to be enrolled. And that is the only type of code, not taking into account anything else that they might put in their code, that won't lead to the extinction of First Nations or tribes through out-parenting. It used to be called out-marriage, but it's out-parenting. Now, the interesting part is that there have been many court cases on Indian registration that are trying to reinstate people who were wrongfully excluded. In 1985, that only had a certain impact on band membership, but the multiple changes since then have not had provisions to protect band membership. So in 1985, when those women were reinstated, the women were protected. They were guaranteed band membership. But in 2010 with C3, there was no guarantee for anyone who'd been excluded. And same with S3, there was no guarantee. And so that remains a huge issue, and it's currently being litigated here, and it's being addressed at the United Nations. And so it's important for people to understand that while we're having this conversation, it's with the backdrop of ongoing litigation in Canada, but also at multiple UN cases that are ongoing. And so I think that's going to be important in the future. And I know we're going to talk about these issues a little bit more, but I just wanted to make some summary points that there are a lot of assertions being made by some bands with problematic codes. And I would say they're in the minority. The majority are not this way, but there's a minority of codes that are problematic, and they're making assertions based on different aspects of the law that are not supported in the law. They're not supported in Indigenous laws, in Canadian laws, or in international human rights laws. And I hope that later on in the panel, we get to unpack that a little bit, because that's the part that I think people aren't really familiar with. But ultimately, when talking about this balance between to belong and the right to determine who belongs is something that has to be you have to take into account colonization, but we also can't perpetuate ongoing colonization when we're doing this. And sometimes that's literally just a matter of working with a First Nation saying, here's the demographics of your code. Here's how it works out for you in 25 years. Does that work for you? Because there's a big disconnect between what people think will happen in a community versus what happens down the road. So I will leave my opening comments there for now, and hopefully we can dig into it later.
Thanks, Pam. That was really great. And yeah, there's some things in there I didn't know about the kind of way that S3 and C3 have kind of left that behind. So I'd love to hear more about that later. Thanks for that. So yeah, I'm going to go next. I'll spend about 10 minutes giving some more background and drawing on some of the research I've done. So as I mentioned at the start of this, I'm Dr. Damien Lee. I'm adopted into Fort William First Nation, which is a Anishinaabe community next to Thunder Bay, Ontario. I'm a band member there, so we're talking about band membership. I'm not a status Indian, so I'm a non-status band member at Fort William. And yeah, I grew up there, and I currently teach at Ryerson University in Toronto. And so I'm going to share some points from drawing from the research that I've done over the past 2 years today, some just very basic summary stuff. As I mentioned in the intro, a number of First Nations in Canada, you know, depending on how you count, 220, 230, roughly a third of First Nations in Canada opted to control their own membership under what's known as Section 10 of the Indian Act, 1985. And, you know, few, as Dr. Palmer was pointing to, you know, there are a few bands out there that are having some problems in terms of how they're rolling out their membership. And so the research that I've done over the last 2 years looks at those people, like the individuals who've been kind of like dealing with those problems. And, you know, long story short, I did a national call to recruit people to the project. I only got 12 people to speak. And I think that's just a nature of the rollout. And I would love to do a bigger project on this and do more rigor. Interestingly, though, the 12 people that did respond are from Western Canada. So I don't know if that means anything, but I'm just going to raise that and leave that. I have no analysis on that other than just they're from the West. But I'd love to see what's going on elsewhere. Anyways, the thrust of what I want to share here today, though, is that the people who responded to my research and allowed me to come speak with them, they talked about struggles, and they talked about struggles that fall into a number of different categories. And I think the interesting thing that they really shared is that in some ways their struggles with band membership, so the way that Section 10 has been rolled out in their communities, is impacting their health in different ways: mental health, physical health, some people claimed as well, emotional health. And then it also impacted other aspects of their lives. And, so such as impacts on their families, because some of their family members are being excluded from membership in their communities, financial impacts. A number of people spoke about, long-standing court cases that they've had to wage in the legal system in order to hold their bands to account for membership issues and claims. And some speak, sharing that they've borrowed money off families, and others, have $300,000 legal bills that, if they win, will go to their lawyers out of contingency agreements and whatnot. So there are big issues at play here. And then the final kind of category that people spoke to in terms of the way that they're impacted is what I would call, at this point, social well-being. Like, they're speaking about issues of being politically ostracized, socially ostracized, being targeted in their communities that they felt because of their sexual orientation, and the way that their children are being perceived because of their sexual orientation. So those are the kind of four major areas that I see in the research, those being health, basically economic impacts, social impacts, and I would say kinship or separation of families. But for the sake of today's talk, just in a little bit of time I have here, I'm just going to focus on the health. Interestingly, when I asked participants, why is membership important to you? And by and large, most of these people felt that they rightfully belong, and they are in the process of seeking their membership over decades by this point. Some of them are members though now. Some of them have gone through the process and became members. So the thing with what they said though, in terms of when I said, why is it important to you? Without any differentiation, they all basically said something along the lines of this is part of my identity. This is part of me securing myself, my sense of self. This is really a way of anchoring myself in my people. I'll say it like that. And they framed it as sometimes as culture or the land, or history. That's the way they would often frame it. But ultimately, it was about anchoring. And that's far different than how a lot of First Nations in Canada will kind of narrate their reasons for excluding people or controlling membership. They'll often say this is about protecting resources, and I don't mean that just in a crass sense. I mean real issues of we don't have enough housing on the reserve, right? And we don't have enough roads, and that was kind of baked into kind of band controlled membership since 1985, and even really 1984 when the initial kind of legislation was proposed and failed, but we won't get into that. And so just to kind of draw this to what Pam was saying earlier, exclusion really is built into band controlled membership from day one. It's held up as a self-governing, a success of self-governance, and I think it can be in certain cases it is, but it's also based on exclusion and kind of band controlled exclusion at times, looking at the ways that communities fought to be able to exclude the children of women who were going to be brought back to their communities under the law. But then they fought to have the right to exclude the children of those people at times under certain circumstances. Anyways, so in terms of the health impacts, so just looking at what people have said, they're folks are feeling express concern, express I would say turmoil at times over things like this is really impacting my self-esteem. They would say things to me like, why is it that my community doesn't want me? And they would say, it's really hard on my head. It's causing me a lot of anxiety. I'm losing sleep over the fact that I know that the people who are excluding me are my family members, but because they have status, like Indian status, or because they are already members, they're seeing me as a potential draw on resources that they get to kind of like pool for themselves. And that kind of experience of being excluded for, I would say some sort of fiscal issue, it was experienced by the people I spoke with in really detrimental ways. Like, it was fracturing, I would say, at times in terms of the way people spoke about this. I would ask people, well, what would it mean to you if you got membership tomorrow? Almost all of them started crying. They would say something like, I never thought of that. And they would break down crying, and they would work through it, and they would tell me why they, what it would mean for them. It would change their lives. And building on why this is important, it would change it because they said that, it would allow them to feel whole. It would allow them to know that this is where I belong. This is the land I belong to. This is the people I belong to. And then they kind of like, they would put an addendum on that. They would say, like, it's not about the money or the resources or whatever. Like, it really is. Like, to me, it was really apparent, just the reaction that, this was affirming for them. And so those are really major major kind of like discovery, I think, that needs to be fleshed out a bit more. This is just initial research. And so, moving on from that, in terms of like just wrapping up here for the little bit of time I have, but what this has made me think about in terms of where the research is for me right now is that I'm starting to wonder if Section 10 band membership needs to be looked at through the lens of social determinants of health. In the sense, is this impacting people's health? That's at this point, that's just a question. I'm raising that because I I'd love to see more research on that. One of the ways that this could be explored would be to compare, if this is, I don't know if this is possible, but to compare, health impacts or some sort of other kind of indicator between Section 10 Indian bands and Section 11 bands. So bands that their membership is controlled by the federal government. Recognizing that that's also paternalistic. I totally understand that that's problematic. But if people are saying to me that, by and large, the hardest thing I'm dealing with in terms of being excluded from my membership is that it's my own people that are doing it, I don't know. I think there's something in there to look at to say, like, well, is this actually having like a demonstrable effect in terms of, people's health beyond the kind of way that we think about band membership in terms of, you belong to a band or you don't belong. Do you get to live on the reserve? Do you not get to? I think there's more to the story. And my research so far has just been, it's pushing me now to think about how could we go deeper into this issue in ways that kind of like unpack some of the kind of latent or maybe even hidden pieces of the puzzle beyond the kind of like surface, all important, but still surface issues of like, benefits and living on the reserve and whatnot. So with that, I'll kind of wrap that up. Thanks. And yeah, I'm looking forward to speaking more with each of you after our little bits here. Thanks.
All right, miigwech Damien. So my name is Geraldine King. I'm from Kiashkazaging, Nishnabek. It's located kind of close to where Damien's back picture is there. About an hour and 45 minutes from that mountain in the background. So my lineage is Anishinaabe. I'm the granddaughter of Hector King and Edna King Wilson, who had 10 kids. One of them is my mother, raised on the trap line. My grandfather's trap line is still existent in the area. And after World War II, so I have experiences with status membership, not membership, sorry, gaining Indian status, not necessarily band membership, but after World War II that my grandfather went to when he was 16 years old. Of course, he became what was considered enfranchised at that time. So when my grandmother married him, she also lost her status. And then it was only after 1985 that all of the family was reinstated. So there is some experiences, and as Damien mentioned, these ideas of what it means to belong and not to belong. But also just to add that my grandfather didn't care whether he had status or not. He still went on his trap lines and to our community of Galbay or Kiashkazaging. So it's just interesting to think about the ways that people have ongoing resistance and been resistant to these efforts, knowing that they belong to those lands. And, something that Ryan McMahon said that I think is actually attributed to someone else, and I forget who he accurately attributed it to, but thinking about the ways that, we can't claim land, the land claims us. So the territorial belonging in these areas, knowing those lands, having those lands and spaces explicate how we belong to them, I think is really important too in these discussions of belonging to our nations and belonging within these communities. However, what I do want to specifically focus on today for my 10 minutes, which I will notate starts right now, is that I've been a research assistant on this project, Damien and I, and as well as Veldon as an advisor throughout this project for the last couple of years, looking at the ways that band membership impacts people, as Damien mentioned, in health, economic, the social, but really what we're interested in, or what I'm interested in particular, is the kinship aspects, but more specifically the way that Section 10 band membership codes impact queer and non-normative family making and remaking, ensuring Indigenous futurities, while these ongoing efforts towards decolonizing sexualities and the way that heteronormativity is very pervasive in First Nations communities in particular. And of course, these are not naturally occurring, or these are not remnants of our own traditionality or the way that we understand one another and various relations and gendered non-normativities and what have you. These are, of course, all remnants of colonization, residential schools, imposed heteropatriarchy, and what Kim Tallbear refers to as compulsory monogamy within communities. So one of the conclusions that we came to early on in this process was that due to the long history of, it's very evident that so many people on our own panel here have been fighting for First Nations women for these reinstatement to our communities through status, through band membership. However, there's no sort of mention whatsoever of queer people in the Indian Act. So Indigenous women, First Nation women have come back and said, hey, the Indian Act is like specifically sexist, racist, it excludes us based on our sex. There's nothing sort of to do with gender in the Indian Act, and there's absolutely nothing to do with the acknowledgement of queer persons. And a lot of this could just be attributed back to the ways that colonial governments were emerging from their own Victorian sensibilities, if you want to call it that, and their European ways of heteropatriarchal embodiments of their governance structures or embodiments within their governance and governments. So where Indigenous women were identified and First Nations women were identified as lesser, and through this sexist legislation, queer people and two-spirit people are absolutely not acknowledged whatsoever in the Indian Act. So then when we think of that and we think of all the work that First Nations women have done and for their children, we can assert that this situation is very, very, very dire for queer people and queer family making and kinships. And thinking about that as well, we know there's a long history, right? 35 years now, 40 years almost, I guess, of actually longer than that, of First Nations women fighting for these reinstatements and these recognition and these acknowledgements. So we have a good base of all the work that these women have done, right? We know these narratives that have been shared, and of course it's not even completely addressed yet. We touch on the ways that it's still sexist in a lot of ways, right? So there's actually no precedent, and there's no research, and there's not a lot of narratives besides what's said amongst our own peers within our communities regarding the way that band membership codes impact queer and two-spirit people and non-normative, non-cis heteronormative family making and family remaking. So the kind of, it's in some ways it's like, okay, let's talk about this, let's find ways to acknowledge how this can be addressed, which two-pronged, right? So we're working against the existing heteronormative values that exist within Indigenous communities, First Nations communities, but we're also working against this existing legislature, which is sexist and promotes this heteronormative, this compulsory monogamy through these nuclear structures. But then it's kind of like sad, because then you think, is this another 40-year battle that eventually doesn't end either? Or are we going to take lessons from the sexed ways that Indigenous women, these accomplishments, right, that Indigenous women have taken on themselves? So yeah, there's some sort of hope, but then there's also just, I think, a lot of disillusionment that how can this be addressed? And again, not to take away from any of this work whatsoever, but there was something apparent and latent, as Damien's talking about, in the Indian Act that is very specific, that you could say, hey, this is extremely sexist because all of these points, right? The way that in my own circumstance, and I'm not the only one that this happened to, obviously, but the way that Indigenous women would lose status if they were married the non-Indigenous man, but that white women would gain status if they married a status man, right? So anyways, we don't have to get too much into the mechanics of that. So some of our research has attempted to pick this up, and specifically in analysis of the data set regarding how membership codes describe family unions. So we looked at, the 200 and Damien, remind me, we looked at 230, or did we look at 240?
We had 240, but you can use between those numbers.
Okay, so we looked at approximately 240 band membership codes that were either publicly available, existing on in public realm, but also through an access to information and privacy request that Damien had filled for this project. So what we found was some of these results, in speaking of the broader sociological impacts that relate to two-spirit individuals and families, they don't contemplate at all whatsoever same-sex and queer family making. So we looked at these 241 publicly available Section 10 codes, and they show that 137 or 57% of them do contemplate the word spouse, and 157 or 65% contemplate marriage. However, of these total codes of 241, 15% define spouse or marriage explicitly along heteronormative lines. So they'll say, when a man marries a woman, she will gain status into this community, or there's all of that. That's the very specific way that spouse is defined, and marriage is by and large through heteronormative lines. But and of those total codes, 7.5% define spouse or marriage along the lines of husband and wife. So they're also saying that marriage is a heteronormative union between someone that is sexed and gendered as a man and sex and gendered as a woman. And we could look at these codes, and of course data can be interpreted in so many different ways, but I think we can't say what was going on in some of these minds as they were being written. We could make the assumption that the times that they were written, right, so during the 80s or 90s or even early 2000s, that a lot of the meaning behind what it meant to be in a union or a conjugal union. Some of them would say legally married, common law, but we can sort of make the assumption through a feminist or a gendered analysis that it likely was referring to same-sex unions. However, where it's explicit, it doesn't add up to sort of it being wholesale. However, what's important to note is that in thinking of that, 0, so no percent of the 241 membership codes include explicit language pertaining to two-spirit or queer individuals and or families. So we could, in the ones that do have some sort of language, we can make some assumptions on them. But really what speaks loud and clear is that none of them talk about two-spirit families or queer families or family making. So this is, thinking about the ways that those banned membership codes then prop up what Kim Tallbear is talking about regarding compulsory monogamy. So for people that, it sends the message that in order to be a part of that community or to belong to your own nation, you have to enter into the compulsory monogamous state of marriage, particularly if you're thinking about family making or family remaking. And then this is further complicated by membership that now turns to DNA, that relies upon DNA profiles to determine whether a child in particular belongs to that community. So again, someone that was very crucial in bringing to bear this thinking around kinship and DNA is Kim Tallbear. And a crucial question that she's asking are, how are DNA concepts being articulated with blood concepts that have for much longer been central to configuring Native American identity and citizenship? And Jessica Kolopanek would go further and say that Native American DNA tests cannot tell you what community you're from, right? She says instead, the test can tell you if you fit into a homogeneous grouping that genetic scientists have said exists with no tribal specificity and no accountability to any specific set of people. So Jessica Kolopanek says there are more fulfilling ways to heal from this dispossession, and it actually involves, as I think everyone would recognize on this panel, particularly, is that relationality that you referred to earlier, Pam, and also that accountability, right? That accountability to a community, that sense of belonging, that activated identity, which of course is complicated by things like 60 scoop, millennial scoop. This is not to in any way whatsoever detract from the ways that these colonial processes have completely removed people from their communities. However, in thinking about the ways that DNA is now on the rise as this arbiter of defining how you can belong to a community is very, very problematic. It essentially turns its head right back onto an essentially biologist way of determining what is really acts of kinship, which are activated and maintained and resonate through a closeness. So my research focuses on Bebeshendim Nishnabek, which is this idea of the closeness of Anishinaabe people as acts of reciprocity, leaning on one another. You think about in terms of kinship turning to a biological sense is very dangerous. We're excluding aunties then that help to raise your children. You're excluding uncles that help to raise your children. They're excluding extended families, adopted families. This nuclear family essentially erodes Indigenous kinship. And it also leads the way, maybe we could talk about a little bit further in the panel, is for things like anti-Blackness, for instance, within our communities. It leads the way for, in myself right now, I have a child, and I think about, I've heard many stories about in times of famine and in times of hunger, where like great grandmas, like Kokums, would relactate to feed children, to feed their grandchildren, and sometimes great grandchildren that were hungered, right? So what does it mean then for a great grandmother who is passing along her bodily fluids and life to grandchildren that may not have membership within the community? So what does breastfeeding mean? Is that not her giving her DNA and her antibodies and her structure, this biologically essentialist structure to them? So we're, even though it skips 2 generations, what does that mean? So I think my time's up, but I think there's a lot of questions around, in particular, DNA and what it means to pass along a biological assumption of how to belong to communities, particularly when it comes to queer and two-spirit folks that should belong and do belong, just maybe not in the legal sense.
Thanks, Geraldine. Excellent. Veldon, over to you.
Great, thanks. It's great discussion so far. I'm Veldon Coburn. I'm an Anishinaabe. I'm from the Algonquin-Pikwakanagan, and my nation's been in the news recently here in Canada quite often. And some of the issues that I have researched, and I've had the very great pleasure to research with all the panel members here, not working on things, but having Dr. Palmater was my PhD external, and I've worked with Dr. Lee and Jibby King for several years now on these issues. One of the things, and that I've worked with, and it's kind of shifted away from sort of my research, but Dr. Palmater is familiar with sort of my examination of the various discourses that have emerged in identity formation. And I was listening to her talk about rights of self-determination, is like, how do we construct the categories as Indigenous peoples as self-determining and exercising those rights? And one of the things that strikes me, and it appears and rears its ugly head sort of in popular consciousness these days, especially in the news, with people claiming to be of particular nationalities, and they actually make the allusion from nationality to race by using the sort of scientific racism that Geraldine was talking about earlier, that to claim membership. And what my research in the past has looked at is the various discourses, some more prominent than others. There's a number of them, and it seems to be there really a wide swath. There's a huge buffet for people to pick from now, and which seems very nice, but some of them are more hegemonic than others, particular discourses, and some of them aren't actually produced by Indigenous peoples, as some of the both Dr. Palmater and Dr. Lee and Geraldine and everyone here have spoken to. Is that where it's given political purchase within Indigenous communities that informs our laws. And for the longest time, well, the Indian Act here has sort of structured our membership within our bands, but people who kind of form an Indigenous identity to now for sort of picking it out of thin air, or those, they in a lot of ways they could parody it, because you see a lot of people who are constructing sort of phony identities, the pretendians as they were, the fakes, the ones who are, going towards or with nefarious sort of motives to access resources that are earmarked or set aside by Indigenous peoples for themselves, actually, oftentimes. In the face of scarcity, they do kind of throw themselves into the fold by forming an identity themselves and picking it out of what is ontologically prior to themselves as a discourse that has a nifty little sort of set of identifiers that they can selectively choose. And it ignores a lot of the, I guess, tenets of being Indigenous, which the word itself, I find it problematic too, being of mixed ancestry, of being both white and Indigenous, is the word Indigenous comes from the Latin root, from sprung from the earth. So as societies and then growing into nations over millennia have sprung from a particular locale in the world, and now we're sort of oftentimes diasporic, which kind of lends itself to those who can pick themselves out to, produce a reconnecting narrative for themselves, which is handy and neat. But, the truth is it happens to a lot of people. But being sprung from the earth as a particular race is problematic to myself, because it ignores the fact that we are political communities and not the racial communities that the state has made us out to be. However, that's where you find a little bit of political purchase amongst governments and Indigenous governments that are operating underneath the Indian Act, is that they say, well, no, we're a biological group. And for us, that sort of, tying us towards scientific racism becomes a little bit, well, again, it becomes a little bit handy for those who kind of want to backdoor into it. So I find this, and it's a little bit paradoxical, because, if we're sprung from the earth, what we're seeing recently, especially for those in the Algonquin community, are those who are reaching back through ancestry to find an ancestor from the 17th century to say that, well, I'm from this community. And it is a form of biological sort of scientific racism, of calculating the sort of genealogical reach as though that person magically, although they never lived in your lifetime, can pass your membership along to you. And whenever I talk to people about it, I say, well, you know, in a way, they're sprung from the earth because they're going to the graveyard to dig out our ancestors. So they are going back to the land. That's their connection. Nevertheless, it overlooks the fact that we weren't really a racial composition. That we were, you know, we forego the possibility of reconstructing our political communities with political membership being vested in, say, citizenship and a set of rights as members of the polis, when we relegate it to sort of a biological calculus. So would we do a DNA test or what have you? And we don't naturalize citizens into our communities too. So, you know, you'd have to sort of accept that some people are less citizens than others. And so, for example, if I am half of my mother who's 100%, and this is, you know, just back of the napkin, am I half a citizen even though I have full membership? Because there are those people within our communities too. And this gets into a little bit of the anti-Blackness that comes out for that Geraldine had spoke to, is they wear the FBI shirts, the full-blooded Indian, or sometimes it says F and B in big Indian. But the full-bloodedness, so the competition is that it arises out of these ontologically prior discourses that have gained a little bit of predominance within our popular consciousness that say, this is how we form our identity. And then outsiders say, well, you know what, I can pick and choose. I can put on the feathers too. So is it a cultural identity? Well, yeah, I see them going to powwows and I can go to powwows too. It's kind of one of the telltale signs too, but the parody emerges whenever they start doing these ridiculous mysticisms and the new romantic sort of nonsense, because they reduce a complex set of rights and responsibilities. And here I'm talking about the those that are like the civic republicanism of, like, you know, you having responsibilities to the political community. Not republicanism is that it's you know, the political party in the United States, but republicanism is that it's the res publica of all of us joining in and saying, well, you know what, in order to breathe life into the political community as citizens, we actually just can't be passive rights bearing individuals that we find in modern Western liberal citizenship. Is just like in Canada, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, people embrace that, which to them, they say, you know what, this whole set of rights, it amounts to the right to be left alone, and I can leave the politics out of it. I just want to be, thanks for the equality, thanks for not interfering in all of my life, but I have no responsibility to maintain the integrity of the whole state of public affairs, which for a lot of Indigenous nations and for those who study some of the past political organizations and arrangements, there was a whole set of structures and institutions which sort of said to you, well, you know what, you kind of had to be raised and educated into becoming into a member of the political society, but it wasn't something that ran through your veins like blood. So it just reducing this to racial calculus almost, and then oftentimes too, the cultural calculus is that, you know, I bought a dream catcher at a truck stop, and, you know, I'm reconnecting, and, you know, I'm, you know, sometimes deliberately too, but not today. It was just happenstance that, well, I don't have anything that would be a visual marker of my indigeneity or something that the cultural would identify me with and say, you know, in the same sort of stereotypes, we could say, well, the Italians, they really love their pizza, and that's what originated there, or they're very good at such and such. And is that, well, I don't really outwardly visibly mark myself as such, but I don't do it actually consciously to avoid it. But you see some, especially in the Algonquin sort of locale, who are trying to be Algonquin for the purposes of a modern land claim, is it almost becomes a circus, because they dress up almost very clown-like. So where do these discourses come, and how do they become predominant within the minds or certain segments of others? Is that Whereas, the plurality of me living in the suburbs as what I think is a fairly modern individual is that I don't need to put on the leather and the feathers to say like, this is my entry into being Indigenous or into my Indigenous community or First Nations. I don't know what else I could add that both Pam and Geraldine had mentioned too, but the thing is, I think with the biological racism, the scientific racism that some communities embrace and implement foregoes the possibility of the naturalization of others into a community. And there's a whole host, and I think it's been studied pretty extensively, that it's really just a plan for termination of, at a certain terminal generation, and it may cut off due to the facts of outmarriage or outparenting, those who do not renew the nation. Nobody's obligated to have children or whatnot, but if it is codified in such a way, then political communities will just disappear in such a way that was pretty much foreseen and planned by colonial powers. And to think about this in terms of the modern treaty that's being negotiated in Ontario with my community, and it's been about 37 years or so, is if we disappear, then the state's obligations to the other party to the contract, well, they no longer have to pay their share of the bargain. It'll end up being in their own hands anyways, so they'll get the land, the territory, and they will have no more obligations. They may have obligations on the books that say, we owe the Algonquins X dollars a year, but then there's no Algonquins left to pay. So they've given us territory, we pay them in perpetuity for it, and once they're gone, well, we got what we wanted. We got all the land, and we have no debtors around to come and collect. So there's a lot. I think identity formation, and a lot of people become very familiar with it because they see people picking and choosing it, and they can spot it. I think Indigenous people are really keen to that. There's just a few features that we also, it becomes a little bit, or at least it's disappeared out of some of our political institutions. Like basically, if you're born into it, it's not something that you're becoming. Nobody really said to me, you're going to be Indigenous one day, and you're getting better at it. Yeah, it's something that can be improved. Performance, like it's almost theatrical for some. I don't go out on weekends, like, going to some of the events where it seems almost like competitive behavior for those auditioning, and it's almost theatrical. It's theater for me for seeing interlopers sort of, or almost fetishists, those who fetishize Indigenous people, and that becomes a little bit cringe-inducing. Yeah, it's paternalistic. It still treats us as objects, without agency, without a political community as well, without sort of political agencies, rather than just, characters that are superficially constructed that could be mimicked very easily. And it's very trendy. I don't know, I wasn't around for the 60s and the hobbyist revivalism, but I see it today. For those weekend powwow warriors who grew up with you as children and had nothing good to say about the local Indigenous population, who are racist on the schoolyard in grade 4s and 5, all of a sudden claim to be Indigenous and actually have no roots to it. But I think I just kind of spread that thin enough that we can have a fruitful and generative discussion, because Pam, Jibby, and Damien had talked about so much prior to me, but I'll interject a little bit of humor about and I won't mention the individual who's thrown the Algonquin Nation and discussions of identity back into the news, but for those international observers, it's become a little bit heated here in Canada, and it's taken a non-Algonquin person to put the Algonquins on the map, or at least to make other people's interests know that the Algonquins here exist. We're kind of one of the smaller nations that don't get overlooked often. So, yeah, miigwech.
Thanks, Weldon. So I have a few questions lined up for prompts, but I just want to open it up because like we've been sitting here for a bit, and I'm sure we have thoughts in our head, listen to each other speak. So I'm just going to pause for a sec and open it up. Did anybody see something that you want, that you're burning to like get on to unpack a little bit here so far? Just from basic. Yep, Pam, go for it.
Yeah, okay, so, you know, I am cringing as Veldon's speaking, and I'm like, ooh, oh gosh, there's no worse feeling than watching a cosplay Indian or a Wikipedia mystic just throw together a mishmash of what they can get at the Halloween store, and then Google whatever they can online, and then do a performance as a shaman for a school board. And it's just the real Native people sitting there going, oh my gosh, how embarrassing, that has nothing to do with our culture. And you know, all the non-Native people are looking around going, that's a bizarre person. But nobody wants to say anything because that would be somehow wrong. And it just, ugh. Oh, it's so disgusting. So the reason why I'm raising it, aside from my disgust, is because what they're doing is not just culture and identity appropriation for all of the wrong reasons. I mean, whether it's, you know, hopeful, whether it's opportunistic, whether it's fraudulent, you know, whether it's strategic, like what, all of those reasons are just wrong. Here's the impact that they have. Not only do they occupy places and spaces that are rightfully ours, but our whole panel discussion is really under the theme of how do we return the rightful people to our communities, clans, villages, and nations, to decolonize and deconstruct those racist and sexist laws, to bring our people back home. Now those people are lumped in with what is everybody's worst case nightmare, the floodgates of all of these bizarre opportunistic frauds flooding our communities. And, you know, as much as some people who study it might be able to say, oh my gosh, you know, you don't need to worry about that, those are just individual, that is a legitimate worry from people who don't know this. I mean, how many people study the demographics and the statistics and all of the court cases to know that the Acadian Métis aren't going anywhere? They lose every court case. There's no such thing as the Acadian Métis. It's Mi'kmaq territory. You know, Métis talk about who the Métis are, and there's just that, you know, no one really thinks that they're going to go anywhere, but they cause a lot of problems in the meantime. You know, you've got companies who are like, well, maybe we don't want to hire Native people because what if we make a movie and then it turns out that this person was a fraudster and we get, you know, roasted over the coals on social media. So what they do is so wrong on so many levels, but they really prejudice people like 60 Scoop survivors who are, you know, 1 or 2 generations away from the community, who don't have community connections. They don't know who their people are, but they do know that they were forcibly adopted out. Some people are going to look at them like, you're just the wannabes wanting to come back. And so this is a situation not of our own making. And what you have with all of these opportunistics and frauds and mystics and whatever is using genocide, colonization, and legislative extinction against us to further their own measures, with complete disregard for all of the people that it's hurting, all of the people who were wrongfully disconnected. And these are really 2 separate situations. And I think the most significant, one of the most important things we need to do in our communities is say, these are 2 very separate issues. This whole fraudulent stuff, race shifting stuff, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Granny's granddaughter who got adopted out, and we need to bring her back because that wasn't her fault. that was, you know, the 60 scoop or whatever, like, and make sure that our people don't get hurt by the never-ending ways in which non-native people, primarily white people, find to exploit our trauma, our vulnerabilities, you know, the minefield of genocide for their own purposes. So I just wanted to say that because there's so many people who are suffering, and we need to bring them back, and it's being kind of overshadowed by all the phonies.
Yeah, that's exactly one of the questions I was going to raise. Is I actually think that at least in Canada, I can't speak in the United States context where these conversations are happening in different ways. I think that our language in Canada in this conversation needs to be a little bit more. I'm not looking down on the conversation. I don't want to be condescending, but I think our language that we have at our disposal right now doesn't necessarily do justice to the complexity, just like what you're saying, Pam. I think that, you know, it's far too easy to lump people into a problematic category who shouldn't be there for very valid historical, even political reasons. There's people who belong but don't belong in according to band membership issues or Indian status, who I think wrongfully get lumped in. And so I think I agree with you. I think that one of the things that we as a maybe society, or at least scholars, should be paying more attention to is how do we refine the conversation or the language that we have, because it's a little bit damaging at times at present, I think. I'll say one thing and I'll stop talking, open it up a little bit. I think about when we're talking about band membership, you know, when we think about this idea of boundary maintenance, like I think boundary maintenance is important, but I think we can all agree that's how you maintain the boundary. And that's where colonization can move in and sink its teeth into our communities. Because like, you know, if a community wants to maintain its boundary outside of the Indian Act and opts into a Section 10 membership code, but then they make it super heteropatriarchal and high blood quantums, you know, thresholds, like it's not really that much different. So the boundary maintenance is an issue. And how do you move beyond that? One of the things that I think about is just to kind of riff on Veldon's point about discourse. We all have heard about the saying, we've all heard it, you know, blood is thicker than water. And this like reinforcing that kind of like, you know, familial kinship is about blood strictly. The way I think about this when I look at my research and kind of reflect on at least the Anishinaabe kind of inherent law about citizenship and belonging, the way I frame it is like, again, it's a riff, but I'll say milk is thicker than blood. And what I mean by that, you know, there's obviously a bit of a sex element there, like a mother breastfeeding a child, but like beyond that little bit of problematic piece, like what I'm getting at is like, it's about caring, it's about relationships, right? Kinship as relationship and responsibility. Anyway, so I'll just stop talking, but just to kind of like push us towards Veldon's point a little bit about, you know, I think challenging the discourse, right? Like discourse is problematic right now that we have, but also we have the power, it's in our disposal to kind of move that discourse into different ways. Anyway, so other thoughts kind of burning in your pockets?
I would add just what Pam had mentioned a little bit about this sort of the new Métis problem, the Eastern Métis, is that, yeah, you know, there's one or two people who will pop up, right? And they're not committing, you know, certain crimes against humanity. They are a caricature, you know, they're worthy of being mocked or what have you, because the inanity and just they demonstrate themselves to be a bit of a buffoon. Present themselves in public and such too. But the problem for us too is, and this gets back to what are these individuals motivated by, is there those that are motivated by dispossession versus others who are motivated by, you know, reparations to their own dispossession from community too. But materially, we see it actually as a very huge problem for the Algonquin Nation here in this part of the world. So for the friends in other colonial settler states like in the US and New Zealand and Australia, I'm not too sure what their land claims and treaty processes are like these days. And I know some places are very hostile, but for the Algonquins in the province of Ontario in Canada, we've been negotiating a modern treaty. We started in 1983, and it's very close to conclusion. But now we have this sort of groups, and we do have a lawsuit where because the Ontario government has now recognized a group called the Métis Nation of Ontario within our borders. So they've kind of been recognized for a couple decades. But the idea is that they're now claiming sovereignty or Indigenous rights to our territory, which we are trying to settle, clear the jurisdiction. It's 36,000 square kilometers for our territory. It's a bad deal for the Algonquins. I won't get into what we're ending up with. It's absolutely horrible. I'll tell you very quickly. It's 476 square kilometers out of 36,000. So 1.2, 1.3% of our territory will be left with us. And there will be they say about $800 million now, but it's not going to be payout to us. It's actually going to be an economic development fund. So that's the kind of money that they would have circulated in the economy anyways. So it would go towards businesses that would have gotten a business grant anyways. So to set that aside is that now we actually have to intervene in cases, and we're wasting resources. We're fighting with those, and we also see it on the Quebec side too. So as Pam says, they've lost a lot of cases, and for us, one of our colleagues that isn't here on discussion but has discussed with us often has been tracking this, and his very successful book, Distorted Descent by Dr. Daryl LaRue, I think maybe a lot of NAISA people will know him, is he has a table in the back of the book, but it's expanded since, that these cases that have gone with these new Eastern Métis groups, and again, these are people who go back about 12 generations, and when you go back that far, you have about 4,000 ancestors, and they pick one that is tenuously because their birth certificate didn't indicate if they were French or English, and they say, well, I guess they were Algonquin, or I guess they were Indigenous, so we'll make them Indigenous. They were born in 1609. We're mixed, we're Eastern Métis, we have a right to make a claim for territorial title, and this has happened in Mi'kmaq a lot. You have peace and friendship and alliance treaties, but you've never modified or extinguished your territorial title. We don't, in Ontario, we had to sort of purchases or deeds on our territory, but we maintained underlying title. We have these new Métis groups that pop up that are saying, no, we're going to the Crown and we're going to tell them that we actually have this. And it's stunning, because these are groups who say, well, we've been here for about 100 years. And I think we've been here for about 10,000 years. Like, we've been a politically organized, a very sophisticated society for, even back our stories that go back 6,000, even the archaeological record, if you want to use that sort of Western scientific mode of understanding, it places us right here in Ottawa about 7,000 years ago as a very large city of Algonquins, as they were. But now we have these groups who thought that they showed up here and they mixed 150 years ago, and that's sufficient for them to override our title. And to get back and close the circles, Dr. LaRue, he's been tracking this, and it's the movement of the Eastern Métis as they lose cases, and they must be up to about 100 or so, and they go through the different levels. And I understand that in the United States that and say Australia, for example, like the lower courts, they'll appeal them through, so there's other decisions on top through higher appellate courts levels that they get rejected all the way. They have never won a single case or had a favorable decision. They've had a few sort of insulting remarks by judges in their decisions about how, like, these are art, works of art, like how they fabricate these things. It must be around 100 decisions so far that, and it could be about, maybe 40 different cases, because, the decisions might be built upon, the same case going, a few motions before the judges is rejected all the time. And so on the one hand, we have a threat for the Algonquin people, is like, well, we're in the middle of negotiating and settling things finally after hundreds of years of contact. Now we have these people that sort of like, come and squat and throw a wrench in the whole affair. Now we have to fight them and also the Crown at the same time. And we have to use our monetary financial resources to pay for lawyers. Like it could be, $3 or $4 million just for one case, and we ran up our debts negotiating since 1992, $29 million just from my small community, the Algonquins in Ontario, of 2,500 people, just for the negotiations of the modern treaty. And so now we have to fight these people. Doesn't sound like big figures, but for a community of about 2,500 people, we're deep in debt fighting off these nuisances, and it's happening on the Quebec side as well. So for our friends around the world, we're only on the Algonquins that are on the Ontario side of the Ontario-Quebec provincial borders. We only have about, I'd say, 25% of the territory, and we're only about 20% of the Algonquin population too. So they're seeing it a lot on the Quebec side, and again, they're not successful in courts, but as court interveners, as friends of the court that come in to say, look, no, this is Algonquin territory, and this new Métis group who says they're a nation on here, an Indigenous nation, really only showed up with a Facebook page in 2007. Yeah, so it's quite apart from just being a source of entertainment, of seeing, all around buffoonery of people who decide to get a tattoo or something, put on some feathers, some leather, and get themselves a drum and start chanting nonsense, and start selling their wares on their Etsy page as their elders, self-anointed. And there are considerable material implications for us.
Yeah, I
Damien,
think.
can I just respond super quickly, because I think it's important, this is one of the most important things. So I mentioned about the cultural appropriation, the identity appropriation, occupying our spaces and places in universities and all that, and then the damage they do to all of the people who are trying to reconnect. Veldon's issue is like a whole nother dimension of these fake Métis. I mean, look at what happened in Mi'kma'ki with all of these non-native fishers, many of them flying Acadian flags, who formerly identified as so-called Acadian Métis, literally taking out guns, burning down buildings, threatening people. That's the reality when you have non-native people appropriating identity. They're not our identity, but look at what we have to deal with: the danger, the property damage, the terrorism, the intimidation, having to fight them in court, the money that's expended. And look at what they're doing in Veldon's territory. Look what they're doing in my territory. They're all throughout Quebec. I mean, they've been fighting the Inuit for generations. I mean, formerly as white supremacist organizations, and now as fake Métis organizations. So people should keep in mind, this isn't just a little bit of ethnicity shopping. We're not just talking about some mystics who are doing it for fun. There's a well-organized, financially supported campaign against real Native people to continue to get our lands and resources in whatever way possible. So that point was so important, Veldon.
Yeah, I think what it reminds me of, Miigwech, everybody, is my mom used to always say, and still says, she's got a couple of sayings in her back pocket. Her favorite one is she'll start paying taxes when you start paying rent, whenever she pulls out her status card. But anyhow, she gets this from my grandfather. But what she would say, and when this phenomenon is emerging is, and a lot of people say this as well, she'd say, I was an Indian before it was cool to be an Indian, right? And what she's referring to there was yes, this long line, our lineages, our ancestry, us being connected to these lines and these trap lines and what have you. But really what she's saying is that white people, fake Métis, all of these people who are missing something within themselves spiritually, whether they see this as an opportunity for economic advancement, which I don't see it's a conundrum, because it's hello, all our land's gone, it's been taken, all the wealth in Canada is reliant upon the land. So why you try to go into a state where you're going to be dispossessed of more land? I don't know, it doesn't make sense. Stick to your land stealing ways, because that's really how you've accumulated any sort of wealth, right? But anyhow, aside from that, what my mom was saying in this time, every time that she mentions this, is that they want all the benefits and none of the struggle, right? And that's not to say that I wish being Anishinaabe wasn't marked by this like long line of struggle and violence against my own mother, my own family members, myself included, right? Based on our racial and ethnic, I guess, background and being Indigenous. And, you know, I don't want trauma to be a part of this ongoing story in our Indigenous futurity. You know, we have so many writers, nonfiction, speculative, science fiction writers, right, that are writing about us in the future in various states. And hopefully the state is like outside of trauma. But what we can't forget is that while I don't want my identity to be focused on trauma nor to be acknowledged by the state in any way, although it has to be, is that we can't discard the fact that there is epigenetic trauma, right, that Indigenous folks have faced and we carry within us. And it's been proven that trauma changes your DNA. And those DNA tests that people are trying to, you know, use to include people into their communities don't take into account, I guess, what could be called those social characterizations of DNA or the economic or whatever it is, right? So there is this, I think that's one of the things that maybe angers me the most, is that Indigenous folks, First Nations folks have this phenomenology of trauma, but also a phenomenology of closeness and belonging and kinship and understanding who we are. But these people that are trying to steal that identity are completely flattening that ongoing experience and that historical and likely futuristic experience of the trauma that is embodied through these ongoing violent interactions with the state, its legislation, its own settler colonial populace that upholds that violence in order to keep those stakes, those claims to the land, right? So anyhow, I think that, you know, seeing those phony Indians or the pretend Indians, it's in some ways it's laughable. Like I remember my son showing me a video one time, and it's like they're all drumming and they're like, "We're gonna go to the powwow, we're gonna have a good time," and we just kind of had to like laugh about it, right? But in reflecting about it, it's so doubly hurtful, because it's like you're trying to take these things that are cool. You're trying to take the symbolism of what now has become fashionable, right? A phenomenon, but you really have no understanding or no desire to join in the struggle, these ongoing struggles, which oftentimes includes healing, intergenerational healing, being on the front lines of these struggles, sacrificing sometimes relationships, sacrificing our places within communities, or negotiating with these places and communities. So I think there's, you know, on one hand, it can be funny and disgusting and what have you, but it's actually very deeply hurtful. And what's the word I'm trying to think of? Anyhow, it's viscerally hurtful, which I think is another aspect that we need to talk about, is when people are doing this, what is the harm, aside from, you know, diluting nations, aside from trying to take resources, which there are no resources, but really how does that get embodied in us with these ongoing struggles?
I think, if you don't mind me saying, Geraldine, that I think a lot of people will recognize, it wasn't, I don't know if it was necessarily shame or whatnot, and sometimes, you know, I'm thankful that and not all my siblings actually look as white coated as me, so I have some dark complexion ones. They just came out. Like, I have a brother and a sister, they're twins, and my sister, they're not twins to me, but they're twins together. And my brother Dan looks just like me, is white coated. And then my sister Diane, his fraternal twin, is, you know, very stereotypically Indigenous woman, Anishinaabe. Is that growing up on the playground, is that you knew you were sort of cast as inferior with the imagery, and also like when you're trying to take a few things seriously, you have these imbeciles who are making a parody out of the seriousness of your stuff. Like, yeah, we see the festivals as well. It just, again, it's the mystics. So the expectation too is like, hey, I can drive up to the native shop in my car and I go back home in the suburbs and I live a pretty, modern life. I'm not going out to the woods to live, talking on a computer. I'm going to go back to my computer because there is no expectation that I'm going to be sitting in like peat moss all day. Yeah. But they're for some, like they that's what they would think, and they would kind of shame you for it, or at least have stigmatized the way that you live. And it's I don't go around to Catholics saying, oh geez, what you're praying to God and you're eating a little wafer that's supposed to be like, yeah, part of the body, and you're drinking the blood out of what kind of craziness. I mean, I respect the autonomy of it, and I'm not going to insult it, but we do find as sort of that in contemporary society that will take a jab, and then you see the people who are taking it overly serious because they go so far to the fact that it becomes a caricature of our life, and you wonder, well, geez, I guess you haven't really got any respect. And Pam had spoken about cosplaying, and then it becomes cosplaying. That it's just ridiculous that you're putting on a costume and you look like fools. Yeah. So yeah, it does pain me because you see kids who are going to powwows, and their regalia is something that they've spent 3, sometimes 400 hours on, with their cookum putting together, their aunties putting every little piece on, and others have just bought something off Amazon and they show up, and like not Indigenous people, but the ones who are trying to cosplay. And I guess maybe I'm looking down my nose and I feel bad for the classism. Maybe I shouldn't go this far, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess that's the sort of the part of the Indigenous formation, is that they just pick out of the buffet of the discourse that exists where it is something for them to, put on putting on the feathers again. So I don't know. Maybe I didn't give anything substantive in that other than just a rant. Sorry, but
always a good rant. It's all good.
Yeah.
We got about 10 minutes left on our time. One question I had for y'all is, in terms of how band membership is constructed today, as one iteration of boundary maintenance, does it do the work to protect communities from, say, pretendians, cosplay, or maybe can it? Maybe I should say that, can it do that work, or should it be totally rethought altogether? Like, can it be renovated from what it is currently? Another piece of this I want to just lay out is, based on what Geraldine was saying early in her kind of talk, was if the band membership codes that are publicly available right now paint a picture of fairly heteronormative kind of imagination of what membership should be, again, can codes be renovated to get beyond these problems, or are we kind of this may sound cynical, but do they need to be kind of like thrown out altogether, or where are we on that? What's your thoughts on that? Like, can we use them as a tool? Are they useful, or are they too limited in kind of their original 1985 imagination? Open it up for anybody.
I have a few thoughts. I think there is sort of a pluralism to our existence, and some of the work that I've done in the past to examine, and it's not too prominent within those band codes that have opted out of, say, Indian Act whenever they get to sort of the cultural features. But the thing is, they ask some places, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, they would like some fluency in culture and language, and if language is part of the culture as well, but also a condition and criteria in some places for being, knowing the traditional or living the traditional way of life. And you also get into, say, the purity and authenticity politics, right? So, I mean, I might be disqualified from it if I wasn't, but in some ways they're getting closer to inclusive citizenship codes. And I remember, I think this was one of the discussions with you, Dr. Palmater, whenever I did my defense and the oral defense, where the questions that you brought up were these band codes designed for particular exclusions, and what can we do for inclusions? Should we err on the side of over inclusivity? And but the sort of the codes that kind of impose a sort of very narrow view of your cultural mode of existence. So would every one of us be sort of excluded if we don't speak our languages? And I think that's actually one of the examples that came up when we were talking about the research results, Dr. Palmater. Can they be rescued at all? And should we have codes constructed that don't discriminate along those lines? Because it does seem a little bit discriminatory, but at the same time, is a code the place to excavate past culture? Is that the job of a membership code, or is that just civic responsibility too? I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So here's been my on the ground experience working with First Nations here in Canada on their membership codes and with the tribes in the US. So it's hard to extract definitive conclusions or predict membership scenarios from the written code. Because one, you have to assume that they're using that code that you see. Two, you have to assume that they never deviate from the code as we would read it, or maybe they interpret things differently than we interpret things, for example. And then there's the evolution of the code. So on the ground, you might have a membership committee where it says you need one parent, speak the language, know the culture, blah, 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 blah. But in actual fact, they've prioritized the one parent because as a community, they've decided in multiple different forums that you don't see in the code that restoring 60s scoop survivors and residential school survivors and forced adoptions to their community is the priority. Because you don't want to punish people who were already punished, like they don't know the language because they were punished from colonization. And so there's a lot of that going on that you can't actually get from the code. And then there's some who literally just don't use the code at all, even though it's technically in place. And then the other thing I have found that's made a huge difference is a lot of bands have had 2, 3, or 4 iterations of their codes since the one that at least I was able to access through Indian Affairs, through access to information, or that was online because they've never updated it or they never put it online. There are several codes ahead, and what you don't get to see is the evolution and what changed and the why it changed. In my experience, most of the changes happen coming directly from the community when they start having applications where a strict application of the code would do an injustice. Like, well, wait a second, we have like 2060 scoop survivors. Of course they should be brought back. Here we're fighting to support 60 scoop survivors. Why would we exclude them? It's no different than a residential school survivor or someone who doesn't know their language. And so there's so much good that's actually happening and changing on the ground. Even the fact that when we first got all the band membership codes, and I know we got them at different times, there's like 13 First Nations who are using strict blood quantum codes. there's less than a handful now who use strict blood quantum codes. And of those, many of them are now in transition. They're considering, they're in community engagement. And I find that's a commonality with the tribes in the US, because blood quantum was something, again, that the US government used in different forms. And you've got all of the tribes that I'm working with saying, but wait a second, there was boarding schools, residential schools, there was all these forced adoptions, there was all this other stuff. How do we get these people back? And how do we assume the obligation to do it? So that's another part that I like, not just that you have the ability to apply, but that some tribes and First Nations are assuming the obligation of trying to help find the people, trying to contact Indian Affairs, trying to get adoption records, trying to do the tracing of where our people went, to actually do the proactive reaching out. And I really like that part of it. Now, of course, there's some First Nations, not ones that I work with, that are, sticking tried and true. But of those, tried and true to some, what I would call discriminatory codes, because it's not, exclusion isn't discrimination. You can't, it's totally proper to say, here's who the Mi'kmaq people means, it's not Maliseet people. It's not Mohawk people, it's Mi'kmaq people. So exclusion is okay. It's when it becomes discriminatory or unjust or a violation of Indigenous laws or human rights or something that makes it an issue. And I have found that in those communities where you go in and you have extensive community engagement about the historical process, about the demographics, about the ramifications, about where all of this stuff came from, you see a move towards, okay, hey, let's change our band membership code. But it's without that information that it kind of leaves people stuck or scared. And keep in mind, and I'll just end on this, we are in a current battle constantly undoing the fear mongering that Indian Affairs is doing. So when, the Indian Act was most recently amended to Bill S3, you had Minister Bennett running around saying, 2 million people, oh my goodness. And then behind the scene, bureaucrats saying, listen, you guys are going to be overwhelmed. You're not going to have any money, and we don't have the money to pay for these people. So, you're really going to have to consider assuming jurisdiction under your own band membership codes. When the parliamentary budget officer did the number was a fraction of what she was stating. And then if you look 2 years after those amendments, it's a fraction of those that they had, not even 1%. So we're fighting the fear mongering of the government, who would want us to keep doing the bad job of the colonizing and the excluding for wrongful purposes. And so I think that's where education and information and ongoing community sessions will help continue to overcome that.
Right. Thanks. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So I'd love to keep talking, but for the sake of keeping to the NAISA guidelines, I'm gonna have to say thank you to everybody. And I really enjoyed the conversation tonight. It was super generative for me, and I hope that you guys also felt the same, and I hope that people actually watch this. So thanks, everybody. I'm just gonna stop recording, and yeah, thanks again.
Thanks.